Hey everyone, this is Brett with thelines.com, and today we are talking NASCAR betting. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss a single one of our videos, and visit thelines.com for the latest odds and betting strategy. Today I'm joined by one of the best in the industry, Jim Sannes. Did I say that right? We talked about it for a second.
I had the same thing where I'll ask someone how to say their last name and then I totally space on it or just say it wrong. We had a guy who was on doing some hockey stuff and I tried his last name 13 times. I try, but just not always. You said it right, though.
Perfect.
So at least you got that going.
Great. Well, he's with FanDuel, like I said, one of the best in the industry. One of the few people that I've seen that really kind of promote NASCAR betting, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So thanks for joining us. Really quickly, can you give us a brief rundown of NASCAR betting? What kind of options do bettors have?
Yeah, so you're looking primarily at, the primary ones are outrights, betting who will win the race. You can bet a podium, which is a top 3 finish, top 5, top 10, matchup bets, group betting. Group betting is where they have 4 drivers and you bet who will finish highest in that group. Also, you'll get some top 20 bets every now and then. Only a certain number of sportsbooks will handle that. And then there are prop markets. I don't tend to delve too much in the prop markets, like number of caution flags and that stuff. I tend to stick mostly to drivers because that's what I have algorithms for. And I want to stick to primarily what my numbers are saying.
For sure. And what are some of the do's or best practices when it comes to betting NASCAR?
Yeah, I would say the big one is always account for track type because things change a lot from one track to the next. And it's not just which drivers excel at a certain track type. It's also what kind of bets you want to make, the volatility of that. You have to bake that into any simulations you may be doing because things are a lot more volatile at Daytona and Talladega than they would be at a Phoenix or something like that. So to me, that's the primary thing is kind of know what type of track they are at. Other things to do, account for equipment because equipment does matter a lot. Obviously, driver skill matters too, but Brad Keselowski at Penske is going to be a lot different than Brad Keselowski at RFK Racing, and you want to make sure you're counting that. Especially early on in the year, you want to make sure you know whose equipment changed, who may have gotten an upgrade, who may have gotten a downgrade, because even in the next car, the next-gen car they're rolling out for 2022, I would still expect the big, higher-budget teams to be the ones that are going to excel. You do want to, I think in general, a lot of times make bets before practice. The limits may be lower and there may be some fewer selections available, but to me, I always want to get the best line that I can get. And let's say I think Ryan Blaney's going to be super fast at when they go out to California for this year. I'm probably going to want to bet Blaney pre-practice. That does not mean I will not bet him after practice. If someone jumps out in practice, I still think they got a good number, I will bet them then. But a lot of times you want to get ahead of the market because you know when numbers are going to shift in NASCAR. That's after practice, after qualifying, and you want to get ahead of that and make sure you get the best number. So to me, a lot of my outright bets are placed before practice, and then you add in head-to-heads and stuff like that once practice and qualifying are in the books. And finally, just shop for the best line. And that's true for all betting, obviously. But I think it's especially true for NASCAR because it's a less mainstream sport. So you get more variance from one book to another in terms of outright bets, which stuff is offered, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's paramount always to shop for the best line, but because you see larger gaps in NASCAR than you may see in other sports, I think it's especially important there.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of expand on that practice that you're talking about. You like to get the bets in. You said pre-practice often, but does the practice, of course it matters, but what are you looking for? Or sometimes, is there a correlation between drivers that do well in practice and do not do well in the race?
Yeah, so there is a correlation between practice times. There's a correlation between current form and track history. And actually, one of the don'ts I had written down was don't overvalue practice times because we can look at practice times and be like, oh, wow, William Byron will top the charts. That's pretty interesting. Maybe I just want to bet Byron for an outright. But it's more so like a factor in the process versus the entire process. So what I want to do is factor in all the stuff, account for current form, account for track history, account for practice. And once you do that, blend them all together, weight them however you want, but just don't over account for practice. And one other thing I would say here is that some drivers don't always push as hard in practice as others do. I found that there actually is kind of a correlation between age and practice times where younger drivers tend to be faster in practice, or they have a higher correlation between their practice times and their race finish than older drivers like Denny Hamlin doesn't have to push super hard during practice. He kind of knows what he's doing. Whereas William Byron, guys like that, may push their stuff to the limit during practice. So just being aware of that kind of stuff is helpful too.
Yeah, and let's expand on some other don'ts, some maybe misconceptions or common malpractices that might lead people to losing bets.
Yeah, so the don't overweight practice is a key one. The second one is don't overweight track history. And this is twofold. It's partly because I care way more about current form than I do about track history. So I want to make sure the guys are driving well right now, because you can look at a guy's track history and say, oh man, like Jimmy Johnson, 7-time winner at Dover. But when you're looking at Jimmy Johnson in 2019, that's a lot different than Jimmy Johnson in 2007. So you want to make sure you're accounting for them in their current context. So sure, look at track history, especially if they are with the same team, kind of in similar form to what they were. It does matter because some guys just have a better feel for one track versus another. Their style may translate better to one place than another. So definitely account for it, but don't over account for it. Other stuff besides, being wary of practice times, being wary of track history is don't just bet non-outrights on guys whose outright number you don't like. So let's say, again, let's go back to Ryan Blaney. Let's say you want to bet Ryan Blaney to win at Auto Club Speedway. You go to the outright market and see he's 10-1. You're not quite comfortable with that. Maybe you're concerned about Kyle Larson, guys like that. And you're like, okay, I'll go to the podium market, the top 10 market. Don't do that necessarily. I have numbers on all these stuff, so I can look at his podium odds, look at his top 10 odds, and proceed based on that. But what you'll see a lot of times is books essentially juice up those numbers, knowing that you're going to go there when you can't quite talk yourself into an outright. So a lot of times I see no value in top 10 bets. Maybe I'll see 1 or 2 per race, but you do want to make sure you are proceeding with caution there, because books do tend to juice those numbers up, and you may not be getting the best number by diving into that market. The final one to me is make sure you don't overexpose yourself to outrights. I think this should be pretty logical if you think about it, because if you bet Ryan Blaney and Brad Keselowski to win, you can't win both those bets at the same time. And I want to make sure I'm not having too many bets that disqualify themselves, where I can only win one of those bets. And also think about like the length of them. So if you bet Kyle Larson at plus 350 to win a race, maybe you don't want to bet Chase Elliott at plus 460. Kind of thinking about the way those things mesh together. So being aware of your exposure to outrights, being aware of your exposure to bets that can't cash simultaneously, I think is a key thing for sure.
Okay, and I have some conceptions. I don't want to say misconceptions, because there may be some truth to this about NASCAR Performance and NASCAR Betting, and I want to find out if there's validity in the data behind some of these. Specifically, we kind of touched on it, but some drivers race better on short tracks versus super speedways versus road courses, etc. What do your numbers usually say?
That is 100% true. That is a proper conception is what I would say there. And that's what I always want to account for, is knowing what they've done at relevant tracks. So let's say they're going to Phoenix. I want to zero in on Richmond, New Hampshire, Martinsville to a lesser extent, but other short, flat tracks. And I've tried to put tracks in buckets. So building out my priors for 2022 right now, what I'm doing is going through what drivers did in various splits, looking at what they did at 1.5 mile tracks, looking at what they did on 1.5 mile flatter tracks, 1.5 mile tracks with banking, et cetera, going through that, tracks with heavier tire wear, and kind of giving myself a read on what they did in various splits so I can see, okay, Ross Chastain last year, his performance at the 1.5 mile tracks definitely was lagging behind what he did on the shorter tracks. Now, that may change this year because they're changing to being the same horsepower package at every track outside of Daytona, Talladega, and Atlanta, whereas last year they ran different packages at the larger tracks versus the smaller tracks. So you do want to keep that in mind for early on in 2022, but in general, yeah, very much so. You want to account for how drivers have done at relevant tracks, because there is a lot of overlap there.
Yeah, and you also mentioned about drivers' previous performances at certain tracks. You brought up Jimmy Johnson. You don't want to bet him based on a performance from 12 years ago. But do drivers that have experience or have experience winning at tracks, do they have a better shot at winning that same track, say, the next year or the year after?
I would probably say no in a vacuum, because I think that the way it works is there's a lot of variance in who wins races. So I don't really want to care too much about that personally. I care how they won. If Martin Truex Jr. dominates at Richmond, then I want to account for that. If Martin Truex Jr. passes Alex Bowman with 2 laps left to win a race, might not care as much about that. So if they are truly dominant, yeah, I think I do want to account for that, because there are drivers, again, who just do better at certain tracks than others, and I do want to account for that, but I don't want to overweight it if it were something that may have been a bit fluky. Like Eric Almirola winning New Hampshire last year, probably not going to want to turn to Almirola at New Hampshire again this year for an outright. It's his final year. There's a lot of stuff working there, but I think as long as you account for the context, it's okay, but you have to make sure you are doing a good job of doing that, because there can be a lot of flukiness in where drivers finish.
Sure. And I think something that people might hear if they listen to the broadcast are, this track's running faster today, this track's running slower today. Is there validity behind that? Let's take out the weather conditions, because of course, if it's raining, it's going to be different than if it's 95. But, do tracks run faster or slower on different days?
Yeah, so it does, but it's mostly based on weather. So that's the key component there. Like, a cooler track has more grip, whereas a warmer track has less grip. And I think that's actually kind of important for a track like Daytona, which has a race in February, but also a race in late August, because obviously things are very different in February than they are in late August. So that can lead to some key differences. Obviously, you'll still take some lessons from what you saw in the first Daytona race, but it is worth noting that the track in late August will be very different than it was earlier on that year.
All right. Well, that's all I got. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jim. Be sure to give Jim a follow on Twitter at Jim Sanas. It's just his name. And keep up to date with thelines.com for NASCAR season and more strategy and race analysis this coming year. Thank you so much, Jim.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me on.